Hi students, welcome to HSC Earth and Environmental Science and Module 7 Climate Science. This is video number 18 and we're going to be talking about changing weather patterns. The learning intention for this video is for you to investigate flow-on effects of changes to climate, including but not limited to changing weather patterns. So to a certain extent we've kind of left our look at some of the factors that maybe have contributed to some of the changes in the climate, and now we're trying to analyze some of the effects of those changes. So one of the important things that we think has actually happened is that there has been a change in the climate. But climate is a long-term pattern. We've talked about climate previously and we've tried to look at how we predict climate over large periods of time, but weather is a daily phenomenon. Weather can change several times in a single day. So how is it that we can link these changes in climate to specific changes in weather? Well, one of the things that we do need to be aware of is that small shifts can potentially make a big difference. And so one of the things that we've seen is some increases in what we might call the extreme events. I guess one of the misnomers around climate science is that a small change being a small average change doesn't really make that much difference. And I guess realistically, a very small change in average doesn't make much difference. But the reality is that that small average change is not the same everywhere. An average change is evened out over the whole globe, which means that different areas may change by different amounts. And sometimes these changes, when they're accompanied by things like changes in the ocean circulation patterns, maybe changes in some of our temperature distribution patterns over the globe, maybe changes in the cryosphere, changes in the amount of ice there is, can all contribute in different ways to creating changes in the weather. We've all seen or heard about the butterfly effect, and the butterfly flapping its wings can create changes in the weather halfway around the globe. These are the sorts of things that we're trying to understand here. Are there small changes that are being made as a result of some of our activities that are actually making some quite significant changes to our weather? Well, there's a couple of things that we can quickly look at, and we will look at these obviously a little bit more during class time. The first one are heat waves. Now, heat waves we have always had in summer, but for some reason they now seem to be getting a little bit hotter and they're lasting a little bit longer. So the heat waves that we were sort of seeing before, I guess if you were trying to define these in terms of seasonality, the season is stretching on a little bit longer where these heat waves are most likely to occur. Heat waves often accompany very high temperatures, often dry conditions, and as a result of that, they can often lead to increase in droughts. And we certainly have seen some quite severe droughts in this country, but also going on for extended duration. So the droughts are increasing. So think to, when we're looking at some of these changes in the weather, about an increase in the frequency or an increase in the severity. Now, either of these is a concern. Both of these, of course, is particularly concerning. So if we're getting droughts more often, that's worrying. If the severity of the droughts that we're getting is greater, that's more worrying. But if we're getting more frequent and more severe droughts, then these are the sorts of things where they can have a very, very big impact on all of the living things in those areas, including humans. We know we've lived through some recent severe bushfires, and there's probably a number of different contributing factors to that, but certainly one of those is climates. A lot of the discussion that happened around maybe was linking some of the bushfires to things like arson, and whilst that may well be the case, we also know that there's been some significant effects of climate that are creating some of these massive fires around the world, not just here in Australia. And the rainfall patterns. Again, we're talking about the frequency of rainfall and the severity of rainfall, and we know we've lived through very recently some of these east coast lows which were smashing the east coast of Australia and creating some huge issues around flooding in our local area. So one of the things that happens as these weather patterns start to change is we can see some changes in frequency and severity of these very important events: heat waves, droughts, the incidence of bushfires, and also rainfall. An interesting study was done a few years back, but it started to look at how the pattern of rainfall was changing and what were the consequences of changes in the rainfall patterns. And so one of the things that we saw, obviously something that's, I guess, goes without saying, is that weather change can affect agriculture. So farmers in particular that are trying to grow crops or raise livestock are going to need to be able to grow certain things either to feed their livestock or to sell for market. And they are going to be very dependent on rain, or at least on the seasonality of their rotation, their crop rotations. So when things start to change, when the seasons start to change, when some of them start to become longer or shorter, when the rainfall increases, or when the incidence of droughts increases, this greatly affects agriculture, agricultural production, agricultural growth, and obviously agricultural prosperity. Prior to 2000, there was identified a steady increase in the summer rainfall for many of the regions, except in the far south. And what you can see from this little graph here is comparisons that were made between the years 2000 and 2015 compared to what the patterns seemed to be like about 100 years earlier. So, and going into that previous, through that previous century. So what we've seen is that in the last 15, 20 years or so, we've noticed that the rainfall patterns are actually changing. So more rain coming further to the south, so an increase in the summer rainfall. Going along with that, since 2000, we have had a step down in the winter seasonal rainfall across the south. So you can actually see that the winter rainfall's kind of receded a little bit back closer to the coasts. And of course, this is one of the things that we do have. Obviously, a lot of evaporation happening over the oceans, and some of that water will come and reach the coast, and those clouds will drop rain on the coastal areas, but not necessarily on the inland. So what we can see is that we've got a 100 to 400 kilometre southward shift in the rainfall zones. So this is where you can see kind of running right across the continent. A little hard to see with my little white coloured pen here, but you can see that in that band across the sort of southern third of Australia, we've got a lot of the rainfall patterns moving further to the south. We know we get some really wet and distinct wet and dry seasons across the north of the country, which is much closer to the equator. And what we're seeing is some of these patterns of rainfall drawing further towards the south. So what difference does this make? Well, what it means is that the summer dominant zones have expanded. So we're seeing more of the sort of summer type conditions for the growing of things like wheat, extending further to the south, and the winter dominant zones contracted. So again, we talked about agriculture is very much about seasonality, when you plant, how you rotate your crops, what sort of crops are the best ones to grow at different times of the year. And as these zones start to change, as the types of rainfall, temperature patterns start to change, so you need to keep an eye on whether or not your crops are still going to reach maturity at the right time, or whether you're going to have to start planting them maybe earlier in the season, for example. One of the consequences of this is that wheat variability almost doubled in the years 2000 to 2016 in the southern states. So the conditions as they moved further down were actually great for the growing of wheat crops in the southern states, but they halved in Queensland. So this movement down meant that we were changing the conditions of weather, was changing the yields for agriculture. So one of the things that we want to try and keep an eye on in terms of changes in weather patterns is how they affect the living things. Now, those living components can be part of the natural systems, and we will look at some of those as well, but they can also be part of these monocultures, these agricultural systems that we've artificially created. We've set up large areas that we've dedicated to crops and livestock, and we need to make sure that the rainfall patterns support the growth of those. And if they don't, then we've got to either change our locations or change our planning, agricultural strategies. So these are some of the implications that are a result of changes in the weather and what effect those change in weather patterns might have on all of the living organisms in a particular environment. Thanks for watching.